On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge into Soviet territory, reportedly the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghan soil, ending a war Moscow had expected to finish in weeks. It had lasted 9 years, 1 month, and 3 weeks instead. Nearly 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, tens of thousands more wounded, and the army that marched out was no closer to leaving behind a stable, friendly Afghanistan than the one that had marched in back in December 1979. 5 mistakes, made early and never fully corrected, explain how that happened. The first mistake was assuming the camping would be short. On December 27, 1979, Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace in Kabul and killed Hafizullah Amin, the Afghan leader Moscow had decided was too unpredictable to keep in power. The culmination of a Soviet troop buildup that had begun crossing into Afghanistan just days earlier. Within days, a new, more pliable government was installed under Babrak Karmal, and Soviet planners genuinely expected the operation to wrap up in a matter of months. Stabilize the capital, prop up a friendly regime, and withdraw most combat forces once the situation was under control. It was closer to the logic of a coup than an invasion. What Soviet intelligence badly underestimated was how quickly that intervention would ignite a nationwide insurgency, uniting rival tribal and religious factions that agreed on almost nothing except a shared hostility toward foreign troops occupying Afghan soil. The war Moscow thought it was starting and the war it actually got were two very different conflicts from the very first weeks. The second mistake was fighting an Afghan war with a Soviet tactics. The Soviet military that entered Afghanistan was built around tanks, armored columns, and mechanized infantry, a force designed to fight NATO across the plains of Central Europe, not to chase guerrilla fighters through mountain passes and narrow valleys. Afghanistan's terrain neutralized almost every advantage that armor and heavy vehicles were supposed to provide. Convoys were funneled onto a handful of usable roads, making them predictable and easy to ambush, while helicopters and airstrikes struggled to distinguish armed fighters from civilians in terrain that offered endless places to hide. In the Panjshir Valley, the Mujahideen commander Ahmad Shah Massoud became a persistent thorn in the Soviet side for years, using the valley's narrow terrain to draw Soviet forces into repeated, costly offensives that never permanently dislodged his fighters. Soviet commanders launched major operations into the Panjshir on multiple occasions throughout the war, each one pushing Massoud's forces back temporarily, and each one watching them filter back in once Soviet troops withdrew to garrison duty elsewhere. Soviet troops would clear an area at real cost in blood and equipment, move on to the next objective, and watch insurgents quietly reoccupy the ground behind them within weeks. It was a war that rewarded patience and local knowledge, and the Soviet army, for all its firepower, had neither in the quantities this fight required. Soviet special forces and airborne units eventually adapted, developing more effective small unit tactics as the war dragged on. But by then, the broader strategic picture had already hardened into a stalemate no amount of tactical improvement at the unit level could fully reverse. The third mistake wasn't Soviet at all. It was the growing flow of foreign support pouring into the hands of the Mujahideen, and Moscow's failure to find any way to shut it off. The United States, through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, worked alongside Pakistan's intelligence service and funding from Saudi Arabia to funnel weapons, training, and money to Afghan resistance fighters throughout the 1980s. For years, that support meant rifles, mines, and modest supplies. In 1986, it escalated dramatically with the introduction of American-made Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired, heat-seeking, and devastatingly effective against Soviet helicopters and low-flying aircraft that had, until then, given Moscow a real tactical edge over Afghan terrain no road could easily cross. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were shot down in the years that followed. Air mobility, one of the few genuine advantages the Soviet military held over an enemy that knew the ground far better than they did, was suddenly no longer safe to rely on. The fourth mistake was strategic as much as moral, and it cost Moscow the one thing an occupying force can't fight its way to: the loyalty of the population it claimed to be protecting. Facing an insurgency it couldn't defeat through conventional battles, the Soviet military increasingly turned to scorched earth tactics, destroying villages suspected of harboring or supporting Mujahideen fighters, targeting agricultural land and irrigation systems that rural Afghan communities depended on to survive, and using widespread aerial bombing and landmines in areas where the civilian and combatant population were often impossible to fully separate. The human cost was staggering. Over the course of the war, several million Afghans fled the country entirely, most into refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran, while the civilian death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Entire regions of the Afghan countryside were depopulated, their fields abandoned and irrigation channels destroyed, turning what had once been productive farmland into terrain even less hospitable to the Soviet forces still operating there. Rather than isolating the insurgency, this approach did the opposite. It created an enormous, steadily replenishing pool of recruits, radicalized by the destruction of their homes and the deaths of family members, with every burned village turning into a new source of fighters willing to take up arms against the occupation. The fifth and final mistake unfolded not on the battlefield but back home, in Moscow. The failure to recognize for years that the war had become politically and economically unsustainable long before it actually ended. The Kabul government the Soviets propped up never achieved real legitimacy or control beyond the capital and a handful of other cities. Forcing Soviet troops to do the fighting, an effective local government should have been capable of handling itself. At home, the war consumed resources an already struggling Soviet economy could not easily spare, while flag-draped coffins returned quietly to towns across the USSR, fueling a growing, difficult-to-suppress current of public disillusionment. Soviet soldiers who did return often came home to silence rather than recognition, their service treated almost as an embarrassment the state preferred not to discuss too loudly. It took until Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985, and several more years after that, before Soviet leadership was willing to openly acknowledge what field commanders had understood for a long time, that no amount of additional troops or firepower was going to produce a political victory in Afghanistan, and that continuing the war was actively accelerating problems the Soviet Union could no longer afford to ignore. Each of these mistakes reinforced the others. Misjudging the initial resistance meant Soviet forces committed to a war they weren't structured or prepared to fight. Fighting that war with tools designed for a different kind of battlefield meant years of costly, inconclusive campaigns that never delivered lasting control. Foreign support kept the Mujahideen resupplied and increasingly dangerous even as Soviet casualties mounted. Brutal counterinsurgency tactics, intended to break the resistance, only multiplied it. And back home, a government slow to admit the war was unwinnable let the conflict drag on years longer than it needed to, bleeding money, morale, and lives the Soviet Union could no longer spare. By the time the last Soviet columns crossed back over the Amu Darya River in February 1989, Afghanistan had cost the USSR nearly 15,000 soldiers, tens of billions of rubles, and a substantial share of the confidence the Soviet public still held in its own military and government. It was, for many historians, one of the clearest early signs that the Soviet system itself was running out of the strength it needed to sustain an empire built on the assumption that force alone could always hold things together. Afghanistan didn't bring down the Soviet Union by itself, but it was the first place the cracks became impossible to ignore.